Good evening, everyone. Bonsoir à tous et à toutes, and welcome to tonight's presentation of OTF Connects on assessing mathematical thinking with Maria Van Vallis. Maria, just keep your microphone off for a few more seconds. Yeah, thanks. That's great. We have a fairly large group tonight, and it's always wonderful and inspiring to see so many enthusiastic teachers sharing their ideas and supporting each other as they learn new and exciting things. We are thrilled to have you all from across the province, and it's also our absolute pleasure to welcome Maria Van Vallis. It is my first time moderating for Maria tonight. I was told by one of my colleagues that her presentations are very smooth and very engaging. From what I have seen of her PowerPoint presentation so far, when reviewing it this morning, I'm certain that it will be very informative and a lot of fun. So at this point, I will pass the microphone to Maria and let her keep introducing herself, probably much better than I could. Maria, please feel free to click on your talk button now to turn your microphone on, and then go ahead anytime you wish. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michel, and welcome to everyone. I just want to acknowledge the dedication of the teachers of Ontario. I know how hardworking the teachers are, that you've spent a day most likely in your classrooms, and yet here you are engaging in professional learning. So I just want to honor and acknowledge your commitment to the profession. And it is a privilege for me to be with you tonight. I have been teaching for over 16 years, and I am an interdisciplinary educator. And I teach mathematics. I teach in multiple subject areas. And for the last few years, I've also engaged in work with the Critical Thinking Consortium because my experience as a teacher has been that it has been one of the most powerful pedagogical frameworks that's helped me create coherence amidst a lot of the different initiatives and research and policies that we contend with. So I have been doing that work in order to share that with my fellow educators. And I wanted to ask how many of you have participated in a workshop with the Critical Thinking Consortium before. If you just want to use your polling button there. Yes, Victoria, please go ahead. Did you want to press your talk button? Was there a question you had? Okay, so sort of half and half. I also want to ask specifically if anyone has participated in any mathematics webinars with myself, particularly the one which was offered about a month ago. Was anyone in that session? So if you wanted to clear your poll, and let me know if any of you were in that session. Okay, great. So a number of you did not participate, and that's fine. This session does stand alone, but I also did want to review a few ideas that were addressed during that session. And if you're interested, and at various points in the webinar, you can absolutely reference that session later and refer to some of the ideas in greater depth. I did just want to give you my contact information, which I will give as well at the end, but some participants actually enjoy tweeting during webinars, so I did want to provide a Twitter handle. And also, I should have put it here, and I'll write it just in the chat box, but we have the TC2 handle as well. I wanted to start by surfacing the concerns because I imagine, I know from my own experience that assessment and evaluation in general, but particularly in mathematics, I think presents some very unique challenges. And I imagine that that's what drew a number of you to engage in this webinar. So I wanted to ask you to think about the two most significant challenges you've encountered when it comes to assessing students in mathematics. And I'm going to ask you to actually write directly on the slide if you're comfortable doing so, and if not, please feel free to write it in the chat box, and I will do my best to keep up with that. And if you also were more comfortable sharing, please feel free to just raise your hand and I can call on you, and you can use the microphone as well to bring your thoughts into the discussion. I know that we have a lot to learn together with each other. Okay, so effective documentation of observations. Victoria, I agree. Quality feedback. Assessing thinking. Ensuring that the work is divided equally. How do we integrate the mathematical processes? The communication of ideas. Balancing observations with products. Finding time to collect a variety of observations, absolutely. Time is always the issue as for us as educators, without question. Engaging in conversations and observations. Okay. What an effective and appropriate observation is. Okay, well, thank you very much. And please feel free to continue if you wanted to add to the chat box as well, because I will be moving forward in just a little bit. Balancing across the achievement chart. So observations versus conversations versus products, and how to quantify that. Students who've learned the tricks to get the correct answer, but do not understand the concepts. Absolutely. And I would add as well, one of my challenges at times is when there's students who are very quick and yet really resist the communication of their thinking and how to do that. Thank you everyone for sharing these challenges. I absolutely love the work of Keith Devlin. I just find that he always makes me think about mathematics teaching and its importance, and reminds me of really what it is that I'm committed to doing every day. So I just wanted to take a moment for you to look at this quote. Again, it's just that reminder of how incredibly important the thinking that we're doing in mathematics is, and how is it that we create those opportunities for thinking, that we nurture that kind of thinking, and how we can use assessment to support us in nurturing the thinking that our students are doing. So tonight we're going to have opportunities to look at really practical strategies, but I also wanted to create an opportunity for us to engage in some deeper thinking and reflection. So if I was thinking of what question could be an overarching question, it's a question that I think we're asking ourselves that transcends this session. How can we make sense of and realistically respond to the significant number of new ideas, initiatives, research, and policies in mathematics in order to develop a coherent classroom focus for teaching, learning, assessment, and evaluation? Math is a very hot topic. It's in the news. We just had a recent announcement from the Ministry of Education around numeracy and mathematics, and we continue to have to really integrate and reflect on what is going to be our focus. How do we create the kind of classroom where students are becoming the numerate citizens, the critically thoughtful numerate citizens that we are aspiring to to nurture as teachers. I wanted to ask if people could just have a piece of paper, or if you wanted to do that on your computer, even if it's just a scrap paper beside you, a thought space, if you will, that I'd like you to continue to refer to throughout this session. And I wanted you to take just a couple of minutes right now and respond to this question, to write down your initial thoughts to this question, because just by virtue of you coming here tonight, I know that you are a reflective practitioner who is continually trying to create a better classroom for your students. So please take a moment right now and jot down your initial thoughts. Just another 30 seconds, and we will return to this question, but just about another 30 seconds to write down some of your initial thinking around this. When I've reflected on my own experience as a mathematics teacher and the journey that I've been on, one of the things that I realized very early on is that I continued to try to find ways that I could explain a concept, a challenging concept, a number of different ways. And I felt that if I just explained it, if I found just the right way to do so, that I could make a student understand. And it was that unlearning process, or realizing in my classroom the truth of John Vander Waal's statement that no matter how patiently, how clearly, with how much passion we explain, we cannot think or learn for our students. The reality is, whoever is doing the cognitive work is doing the learning. And if we are, as teachers, are taking on the load of the cognitive work, then our students are not engaged in the kind of thinking they need to engage in. So one of the things I'm hoping to do tonight is to help provide a framework that will allow us to look at assessment from a different perspective. And that framework is really about how we can create a thinking classroom. And a thinking classroom is a classroom where students are learning to think. We're actually explicitly teaching them the tools of thought, and they are thinking in order to learn. They are thinking in order to gain that deeper understanding. And it is the way, it is the method that students are engaging with their understanding of the subject matter and curriculum. And a thinking classroom is the classroom where we're inviting students consistently and supporting them to think rigorously, to think in a way that is creative, where they're also producing new ideas, and they're working in concert with others, they're collaborating. So it's that critical, creative, and collaborative thinking. So how do we do that more effectively? And the framework I wanted to introduce is the 5 principles of a thinking classroom, and we're really going to focus on one of them with regards to assessment and touch on a few of the others a little more indirectly, or sometimes with me bringing forward an idea. But I would say that orienting our classroom in terms of some core principles can help create the kind of pillars where we can orient ourselves to all the different policies and initiatives and ideas and strategies and practices that exist when it comes to mathematics. And just really quickly, I wanted to distinguish a principle from a practice. So a principle is really what it is we're trying to do, the desired feature or condition that's going to inform and motivate our actions, and the practices are implemented. They're what we do to achieve the desired outcome. So when we think about the 5 principles of a thinking classroom, and then a number of different practices that I'm sure we already do that help to activate that and bring that to life. And really quickly, why is it that we should focus on principles when we're thinking even about assessment? Is when we focus on principles, it allows what we're doing in our classroom to be anchored, that we have an intentionality to what it is we're doing and how we're designing our classroom, that we're slowly building and adding and integrating, as opposed to, constantly, what happens in education is there's a program and then there's a new program, and we sort of develop this fatigue of initiative fatigue, I call it, where we're constantly like, this is the new thing and now this is the new program. But when we orient ourselves according to principles, we can really build over time, over the course of our entire teaching career. It allows for a diversity of responses because we all teach different students and in different contexts where certain practices to support those principles will work better. It gives us more autonomy and lets us be more decision makers of what's happening in our classrooms, and it's less intrusive. So when I'm looking at how we can create a thinking mathematics classroom, to me it is so helpful to think about orienting what I'm doing in my classroom according to these 5 pillars, these 5 principles. So I'd like my students to be engaged in continuous inquiry, which again is going to mean some different things. That technology is enhancing the learning. It's not just an add-on, but the technology is there for a purpose, and its purpose is to enhance. Otherwise, technology can be a bit of a meaningless add-on or something that is the new latest thing, but it's not necessarily deepening the learning. In my classroom, I want engaged learners, an assessment-rich environment, and that's what is going to be the main focus tonight, but also how we build that self-regulated learning, where it is the students who are taking increasing ownership over the learning process. So this is a framework I'm hoping will help as we really try to zero in and create coherence. So I just want to talk briefly about engagement and just offer you to take a look at a new taxonomy of engagement, where we move away from just feeling that because the students are on task, that means that they're engaged, or even that they're entertained, that they like what it is that we're doing. I mean, of course we want them to like it, but truly where we're aiming what we're doing in those upper levels where we're challenging them, where they're caught up in a challenge and ultimately being transformed. And I know that for us as teachers, the soul of what we do, the heart of what we do, and we don't always get to see it. It's not like I always say someone who's a designer of something can build something and say, I created this. But with teaching, we're planting seeds and we don't know what's going to come of what we do. But when we have a student who might say to us, I didn't think I could do math until your class. I mean, that's the kind of transformation. Or we see them so engaged and caught up in a task that it actually allows them for a moment to go outside of the things that can distract them. And I do believe that thinking tasks that are oriented towards critical, collaborative, and creative thinking have the potential to engage students. But there are some really important dimensions to doing so that we have to understand so that we scaffold students. When we look at engagement, we think about our own engagement. Whenever we're engaged with something, we're involved and caught up in it, we're engrossed and committed. But when we're talking about educational engagement, what we're looking for is when teachers and students are personally committed to pursuing the educational goals and successfully performing ongoing teaching and learning tasks. And I know that this is what we, in spite of so many of the challenges that we face in the classroom every day around this very issue. I call engagement sometimes the holy grail of education, you know, that we really are always looking to design tasks that will capture our students and be able to help them achieve really important and powerful learning outcomes. I also wanted to take a moment just so we have a definition of critical, creative, and collaborative thinking. Because again, we speak so much about these three ways of thinking. You know, this is very much part of 21st century learning, but I think having a very clear definition is important. I also want to say if at any point, if I'm going too fast or you have a question or you'd like me to slow down, please do not hesitate to let me know in the chat box. This is, you know, for all of us, and I'm talking away, and I really want to as well know if what I'm saying is landing with everybody. Great, thank you, Heather. Thanks, Maria. Okay. I did bring up this slide in the last webinar, and I do want to highlight it again because to me this is really important to take us into our focus on assessment. This was done, there's a big study done by the Canadian Educational Association, What Did You Learn in School Today, in 2009. And what they found was that when students did not have the skills to engage in the challenge, nor were they being challenged, they were likely to feel quite apathetic towards learning. When students had a high degree of skill and weren't being challenged, surprise, surprise, they felt that what they were learning had little relevance and they were bored. What I find interesting is the two at the top, where when students do not have the skills to engage in a challenge but they're being challenged, they're likely to feel apprehensive or anxious. And I think that this also happens at times with the way that inquiry can sometimes be done, where attention isn't paid to the kind of scaffolding that's needed, and we're not clear on what it is, what our learning outcomes are, and how we're going to support the students in getting there. And the orange spot is really the sweet spot that we're really wanting to get to in our classrooms, where students, we're moving them on that continuum of building their skills and they're being challenged. And that's when students are most interested and feel successful in education. So this is clearly where we want our instruction and the design of our instruction in classroom to help us achieve this. So let's really get into the topic of tonight, which is assessment. And when we're looking at the principles of a thinking classroom, and this idea of an assessment-rich environment. So what does that mean, an assessment-rich environment? Obviously, a key dimension is feedback and how we're going to engage in that feedback. So I want to ask people, and there's going to be a slide next where you can write your responses directly on it, or again, please feel free to use the chat box if that's easier for you. So I want to ask you, what do we know about these students? So we've got student A, student B, and student C. To think about what kind of data does this give us, and what kind of information does it give the students? Okay, so we've got a question. We have 3 different types of responses. So what do we know about these students? What kind of data does it give us? And what kind of information does it give the students? So I'm going to ask you to respond to that here. So again, we had 7 times blank equals 28. And we had student A said 13, student B said 4, and student C didn't have a response. So what do we know about these students? Let me just, I'll write in the chat box their responses just to remind people. Okay, so student B knows their multiplication tables. Student B understands inverse operation, multiplication, division. Student C is afraid to answer or just unsure. Students might not understand the concept. Someone's saying not a whole lot, as we don't know any strategies used evidence of conceptual understanding. Student C may not be engaged. It's so interesting as teachers how we can look at, right, a very simple statement. We know student B said 4, we know student A said 13, student C said blank, and we're already speculating on what this could mean. We don't know what student C knows. The student might not understand the concept, so unable to multiply 2 digits times 1 digit. Student A may have misread the question. So a lot of speculation. There's a lot of speculation that currently we've got around these students. Student C may need more time. It's hard to know what's going on. There's no context. It's hard to know what's going on in their thinking. It tells the student what the answer is. We don't know much, depends on what was asked. Okay, so what I'd like us to do right now is we're going to watch a video. I'm going to ask if Michelle would step in and just provide some instructions here for the participants in terms of the best way to watch the video.
Yes, hi. So I just posted in the chat box the link to that video. And so what I'm going to ask you to do is to either click on it or cut and paste that link in your browser and then watch the video. It takes about 3 minutes. There's probably an ad before the video, so it may take a little longer depending on the ad. And then when you're done watching the video, come back into Blackboard and give us a green check mark to let us know that you have returned. Okay, thanks so much. Enjoy the video.
And I do want you thinking about these questions as you're watching the video. So the questions are, what do you notice about each student's thinking? What questions do you have about each student? What do you think each student might need? And is there anything that they all need? Okay, so thinking about these questions as you watch the video. Okay, thank you. Please go ahead. So I do notice that people are starting to come back. I'm just going to give them a little more time, but as you're waiting, please think about these questions. What do you notice about each student's thinking? What questions do you have about each student? What do you think each student might need? And is there anything that they all need? And if you want to respond to any of these in the chat box right now, please feel free to do that. Yes, there is, Kit. There's a similar Mon Pa Kettle clip. Yes, he's missing an understanding of place value, what a number is worth. Yet so difficult without that communication and seeing it to know. So when we think about sometimes what the traditional pen and paper tests have revealed, in many instances it's not a whole lot, and yet what I noticed about us as educators is sometimes it's very hard for us just to participate in a straight observation, that we are always looking and speculating and hypothesizing, and sometimes I would argue rushing to judgment before we have enough evidence or data in order to really decide what it is that a student might need or what it is that might be going on. A great question, Nadia. Where did this misconception begin? Yes, the student with the correct answer isn't able to explain it. Jamie's mentioning that point. He might know the algorithm, but not truly the deep understanding. The man who knows that 13 times 7 is not 28 still doesn't have a good enough understanding in order to convince the cook that he's wrong. Right? So some really interesting things, some really interesting insights that we've gotten about the student's thinking, and the student who's not saying anything, we don't really know a whole lot. We don't know if he knows and just doesn't have the words to say. We don't know if he is in the same boat as student A. We really don't know very much yet about student C. Right? We don't know. So sometimes, again, how do we step back and observe student thinking? So that difference between what we can know from an answer and sometimes how we try to conjure up a lot of information, and yet when we're seeing the actual context, how we can get a very different picture around student thinking. So some key questions that I want to take us through. What do we assess? So when we're assessing thinking, what is it we assess? So where would you say currently in your own classroom or in your sense of the landscape, where do you think the current focus of our tasks and assessments are? Is it computational skills, or is it in the conceptual understandings and the habits of mind, some of the processes, the mathematical processes? Where would you say the current focus is? So again, if you'd like to just type it in the chat box, or feel free if you find a spot on the slide itself to type it. So Manpreet, I think it's in both. Definitely a combination of both. Jamie, you're so right. It's easy. It can seem very easy to assess the computational skills quickly. Okay, and I know a number of boards are talking about the idea of a balanced math program and what that means. So absolutely, I'm not going to be here asserting that the computational skills aren't important, or that fluency in numbers, that ease of number sense, and algorithmic flexibility isn't important. It absolutely is. But I do want to turn our attention to this conceptual understanding and those habits of mind, and specifically the processes, because I think that's been more challenging terrain in terms of mathematics education, and especially in terms of our focus on assessment. I just want to take a moment and look at this quote. regarding some of the broadening and deepening of our understanding about mathematics that's been emerging over the last, I would say, last few decades. Yeah, so Heather's made a really interesting point. Computational is the assessment, but conceptual is observed. So this point around being a good thinker in any domain may be as much a matter of acquiring the habits and dispositions of interpretation and sense-making. So it comes back again to this notion of nurturing quality thinking and the habits of a quality thinker. And how do we do that in mathematics? Here's what we know. We know that when a student truly, deeply understands something, this is what they are able to do. So when we think about our students from the video clip that we saw, we didn't see a deep understanding at all across the board in student A, B, or C. Because when a student truly understands something, they can explain it, they could teach it, they can use it, they can combine it, they can create it in a different context and transfer it, discover, question, generalize, assess. This is what they're able to do with a deep understanding. And Kit is saying these are good checks for teachers to monitor their understanding of math concepts as well before teaching them to students. A really great point, because at times, especially in the elementary grades, you know, we are dealing with a number of us who might not have a deep mathematics background, who, again, were probably good at it, but what does good at it mean? How deeply did we actually understand it? And so teachers are also, many teachers are also going through a kind of deeper learning themselves. So thanks for that point. So I'd like us to take a moment now and look at these core mathematical processes, these core competencies that really are at the heart of mathematical thinking. And what I want to assert is that in order to connect thoughtfully, to problem solve in a thoughtful way, to reason and prove effectively, to reflect, to select tools and computational strategies, and to communicate, these processes are examples of critical thinking. We need to think critically in order to do any of these well. And so the framework of critical thinking can be an incredibly valuable lens for us as we're both designing tasks and assessing the tasks in our classroom. Because in order to proficiently apply these processes, we need to think critically. I don't see there being any other way. In order to connect proficiently, we have to think critically. In order to problem solve proficiently, we need to think critically. So when we're promoting the thinking classroom, I'd like to draw your attention to the 5 intellectual tools along the bottom. Background knowledge, criteria for judgment, thinking vocabulary, thinking strategies, and habits of mind. Oh yeah, Maria, you're right. Representing should absolutely be there. I think that was just a little error on my part. Thank you for noticing that and pointing it out. I'll be sure to fix that. So here's a frame for us to help scaffold our students in terms of background knowledge, criteria for judgment, the factors they need to consider when making a decision, and I'm going to unpack this further. The vocabulary of thinking, words like describe, analyze, infer, these are words that when students don't know them can absolutely trip them up and be a barrier to engaging in a thinking task. Students need some kind of thinking strategy, and in math, we're very good at this, but sometimes not always aware that this is what, for example, a number line is. A number line is a thinking strategy. Certain math manipulatives are thinking strategies. They're ways to help students sort through and make decisions. And then the habits of mind, the personal characteristics that students will need in order to be successful. So I'd like us to take a moment right now to return to the question that we started with, and to take a moment now and add to your initial thoughts. Perhaps some of your thoughts may have been revised, some things you might have expanded on or see a little more deeply, but please take a moment right now, about 2 minutes, to return to your initial thought space. Just have a chance to integrate some of what we've learned so far. Yes, Manpreet, please go ahead if you have a question. You can press the talk button, or please feel free to write in the chat box. Could you clarify what you mean by resources for understanding student habits? Do you mean habits of mind? Absolutely. On the critical thinking website, which I put up at the beginning and I will again at the end, and it will be available after, we have resources there for looking at habits of mind. But also feel free to email me and I can send you a list of some of the habits of mind as well. So just another minute. Please go ahead, Manpreet. Okay, so we are going to move on. So when we're looking at that first question, what do we assess? I want to assert that partially a powerful lens for us to look at is assessing those intellectual tools, and we will continue to gain an understanding of what that might look like. How do we assess? When we are assessing quality thinking, how do we do it? So just have set of images here, and I know that many of us have been over the last decade and longer, really over the last couple of decades, there has been, again, a broadening and deepening of our understanding of assessment. So we have on the left, perhaps a very dramatic way of representing a kind of umpire stance, right? The inquisitor, the grand inquisitor, and on the other side, more of the coaching stance, the supportive stance. So when we look at that difference between a learning coach versus the evaluation umpire, just take a moment to look at this difference, and if you want in the chat box to add anything or challenge any of this, or if you feel it resonates in terms of your own experiences, please feel free to do so.
And if your vertical tool strip is hiding part of the slide, you can just grab it and move it down or to another part of your screen.
Thanks, Michelle. So two before me, Tara, means that students are asked to inquire to two other students before they come to the teacher, so that they seek a clarification from someone else before, because I imagine that many of us here tonight have experienced that feeling, especially in the large classes that a number of us are teaching in, where we feel that there's all of these hands and the students are needing our attention, and that self-regulation. This is where the other principle of self-regulation comes in, where students have gotten very used to the teacher being the source of information, and again, doing the thinking for everyone in the class and being the arbiter of what is right and what is wrong, and not enough of that metacognitive awareness and self-regulation is being built. So this is a small step to do that. Yes, Jennifer raised the point. She uses 3 before me and finds that students that typically don't persevere through a task have to. Absolutely. Heather mentioned she really likes the last point about a learning coach and often feels like she's not doing enough formal assessment, but find the daily assessment so much richer. Yes, it really can be. Their research continues to support the assessment-rich classroom. I participated in a course with Jo Bowler of Stanford University, and she speaks about a research study where they had 3 sets of students. In the first set, they gave only descriptive feedback, formative feedback on the work that was done. In the second group, they gave only a grade, and in the third group, they gave a combination. And the research showed that the students who got only the formative feedback actually gained in their achievement at a fairly substantial rate than the other 2 groups. Now, the group that got a combination of both was sort of in the middle, and the group that got only a mark did not progress in their achievement as much as the other 2 groups, which I think is really, really illuminating. I just want to go and scoop in some of these really thoughtful comments from everybody here. Right, absolutely giving that immediate feedback and space for consolidating. Jamie, talks about having had negative experiences. Yeah, thank you for bringing that up with the misconceptions that can come through. Or to experts, absolutely, or helping others. That is a really good point. So, certainly how we engage with these strategies is really important, and we want to do them in a thoughtful way. No strategy is ever like a magic bullet, that's for sure. I think, too, what it really comes down to is the two before me can be a step, but what we really want to get to is the self-regulation where students are able to assess their own work. That's the ultimate goal, and it is at times can seem like a very overwhelming journey. But again, I'll show some prompts that continue to help us move towards that. Here's some interesting points about traditional testing. Again, when we're looking at assessment, particularly in mathematics. Yes, Jennifer. I know. We won't get started on that conversation. But again, increasingly, this is true. It doesn't mean we shouldn't test, or that sometimes, again, given some of the realities or some of the constraints of needing a mark, I put that in quotations, that sometimes needing a mark, and how we do that, or also the reality that students are going to be in testing scenarios, and to what extent do we want them to have that experience? Yes. This is a great group. I'm having a lot of fun. So that brings us again to this whole idea of the triangulation, the product, the observation, and the conversation. Will I be sharing some examples of how teachers might collect and use observations? Yes, I am going to be moving there, definitely giving you some ideas. So what are we looking for, and what evidence do we need to see? So that's a question. And the more we can align our learning goal in the context of a particular concept or unit, so that we become more clear of the thoughtfulness with which we want to see students engaging with a particular conceptual understanding using the mathematical processes, the more we can start orienting ourselves so that we are looking for students who are carefully assessing which strategy would be best, or we are seeing students who have a particular background knowledge. So what we saw in the video was a student who didn't have the sufficient background knowledge in place value in order to engage with the challenge. I mean, again, I think, Jane, your question, are we to consider practices balanced in amount? I think that this is an ongoing conversation, and that there isn't necessarily one right answer, because there's different contexts and situations, and that I want to encourage us as teachers to be decision makers about to what extent, and sometimes it's a unit that will lend itself more from your experience to particular forms of assessment over others, or particular tasks that you've designed for a unit. So I think we want to be nimble and thoughtful ourselves about how we're engaging in the triangulation. So how do we assess student thinking? Again, going back to this idea of these intellectual tools, and this is just a lens to help us consider what we might be looking for. So take a moment to look at the tools and some of the questions we might be asking in our observations. And of course, this is going to be made specific depending on what concept you're studying or that you are engaged with the students. So for the last one, for example, do you see a student persevering? Do you see a student paying attention to detail? Do you see a student who can be open-minded when considering other strategies. I'm sure we've all had the student who has one way of solving and thinks that that is the right way. And it can be difficult at times to bring that open-mindedness of different potential strategies, and sometimes ones that are more efficient. I'd like us to look for a moment. I want to unpack what it might look like if we are trying to assess the ability of a student to make a reasoned judgment using criteria in the context of a mathematics classroom. So let's say this is what our learning goal is. We want to see a student analyze a math problem and check the solution, identifying key features of the problem and checking to see if the solution makes sense. So this is relating to the core process of problem solving. We want to see the student identify the question by accurately restating the question or task. We want to see them record important information, so selecting relevant information and avoiding irrelevant details. We want to see them check their solution and carefully apply the criteria to check that their answer is reasonable. This is huge. We're always wanting to ensure our students have that capacity to determine for themselves whether their answer makes sense and is reasonable. And I wanted to point out that these are available on our website, particularly if your board is a partner with the consortium, and you should be able to find that out. You can use your board email address and you have access to an incredible array of tools across disciplines. And I've pulled this right from these tools for thought, and we have a series of lessons which I'll show you in mathematics. And if not, there's a small fee for a yearly membership that gives you access to these tools. So these are some of the tools, and we're looking right now at the tool of analyzing a math problem and checking the solution. So if we're looking for the student's ability to identify the question in that they can accurately identify and restate the question or task, what might we be looking for? How do we line that up with some assessment evaluation criteria? And again, I know that the column on the left, you could use levels or numbers, various ways that you want to organize that. But I've just put it there to be accessible to everyone tonight because boards do different things. So we want to see if they're doing this at a truly proficient and excellent level, that they can clearly and accurately summarize the question or task in their own words and in symbols. Or they can, if they're doing it competently, you can see that they identify the question by copying the relevant section from the original. Or at a basic level, they might require support to identify the question or task. So that is giving us information about the student's ability to solve a problem effectively. It's that ability to know what it is the problem is asking them to do. And if we're looking for their ability to check the solution and carefully apply criteria to check that the answer is reasonable, so you can see them actually trying to determine if their answer makes sense and is a reasonable answer, this could be what we might see when we're looking. Yes, ma'am, please go ahead and write your question in the chat. Right, that we see students independently making the revisions needed, or sometimes, or not able to recognize the reasonableness. They're not able to see that it doesn't make sense. So this is, again, giving us very important, very specific information about their capacity to solve a problem. Manpreet, could you clarify your question? I'm not sure I understand in terms of creating common language between very good and excellent. When you say common language, are you referring to the sense of levels or I'm still not sure. I apologize. I'm just not sure I'm understanding. Right, carefully applies. What does that mean? Carefully applies opposed to applies. And again, I really think that here it is our professional judgment that comes in, where you can see at times when a student is really independent with their ability to apply a strategy, that they, you know, when you see a student actually highlighting or underlining or circling words in a problem, you can see that high level, as opposed to a student who's competent in the way they're doing it, but might not be engaging with the same level of consideration or thoughtfulness, and that's a bit of the distinction. But I believe it's our professional judgment that comes in with some of those nuances. So thinking about how we can tweak our questions to bump up the critical thinking, these tweaks in our questions can actually help to surface more of the thinking we want to observe and see, so that we can assess, provide that guidance and feedback, and ultimately be able to evaluate it. So the way we phrase our questions is so important, these little tweaks that can truly surface more of the thinking we want to see. I just want to make sure everyone has had a chance to look at this. I'm not going too fast. So when do we assess? Well, I think we know that we're assessing all the time. But I want to ask you, to what extent do you think what the example here is an effective formative assessment strategy? And again, feel free to write on the slide itself or just in the chat box. Yeah, in terms of it being helpful before a test. And yet sometimes I think the struggle we've had around formative assessment, and I definitely think our own collective knowledge as educators is really continuing to grow around this, but you know, at times we felt like that formative means we just have to give these opportunities before the big shebang. But really the importance is, what are the opportunities for feedback and growth that we're providing? So sometimes it was, okay, formative means I'm going to quiz, test. And sometimes, and I'm not saying that that's a bad practice, sometimes, you know, that is something that you might choose to do for a particular unit. But how can we reframe our formative assessment, particularly when our aim is to provide that kind of scaffolding and feedback on the thinking itself, right? It's not just for us to know who's getting it and who's not that that isn't important, because it is, and we use a number of strategies to know that as teachers. But how do we use our formative assessment to really surface the student thinking so that we can make some successful or more meaningful interventions? So I'd like you to take a look at this example, thinking about what would you find out about student thinking from this one question, imagining that you gave it at the beginning of the unit. So rather than a long diagnostic, for example, and again, you still might choose to do that in certain scenarios, but just to look at this alternative for a moment. What do you think you'd find out? And again, please feel free to add to the chat box or right on the slide itself. Manpreet is saying it would really tell you that they understand fractional parts or not and can apply knowledge they have of fractions. It would give the teachers a starting point in their lessons. Absolutely. Is there anyone else? I just, again, don't want to move too quickly. It would tell you if they truly understand because they have to provide reasoning. Absolutely. You'd know if they truly have that conceptual understanding. Right. Sylvia is acknowledging she'd learn a lot. So these simple tweaks to the way we're designing our tasks and our assessment pieces, even the formative pieces, one question can tell us a lot about our students in the very beginning. And absolutely, Victoria, the results would then drive your instruction. Thanks again. I always love doing these webinars because it's just further proof of the awesome educators we have in this province. And really quickly, a number of you are probably familiar with John Hattie and the work he's done, and some of it has been it's been critiqued, but I still find it so fascinating that when he looks at the influence of the different teaching strategies on student achievement, how formative evaluation was at the top of the list. So how powerful a strategy this is in our instruction. It really is one of the most powerful things that we can do. So coming back to that principle of an assessment-rich classroom, the research continues to affirm its role in what we're doing. And how you're absolutely right, if they could communicate their thinking. And even their struggle to communicate would give us important information. So here's some different examples of ways we can do formative assessment. Sherry Parrish has a great book and set of videos, Number Talks, which are really, really wonderful. They are based in the States, but she's also collaborated with Joe Bowler. And I just find that this work on Number Talks has been really insightful and illuminating. Collaborative clued corrections. I've got a link at the end from a book, Bringing Math Students into the Formative Assessment Equation, and there's more detail about how to use collaborative clued corrections, where you basically don't tell the student where the error was, but you say something around, in one of the problems, this is what you did, and the student has to find their error. So it's making them really think. Comments-only marking, tracking sheets that are specifically aligned to the thinking you want to see. So going back to the example I gave with the intellectual tool, so having in your tracking sheet, designing some of the very specific processes and kinds of thinking you'd want to see, and using that in your observations. Exit and entry cards, of course, just one question, whether right when they come into class or as they're leaving class to drive instruction. Listening to students, as they're working, and really, really listening for the thinking and what's happening and what they're doing. Conferences and observations. And again, I know we can't observe all. I've got a class of 34. I can't observe all 34 of my kids at once. So sometimes as well, we're going to focus on the students who might be struggling in a particular area and make them a focus of observations as well, in order to triangulate, or students who might have issues with communication. So we're going to use our professional judgment when we're trying to triangulate our assessment. Also, I wanted to give a chance, and you can write in the chat box about any formative strategies you use that haven't been mentioned, so that we learn from the collective wisdom. Absolutely, math journals are one way. Oh yes, Anik, my favorite no. Yes, I learned about this from another teacher, and it's fantastic. So I encourage people to check it out, where a teacher basically selects from the students some of the errors they make, but celebrates those mistakes, you know, as the favorite, her or his favorite no of the day or of the unit, or of that particular question. So it's really, really wonderful. So please feel free to keep posting those in the chat box so that we can all see them. So, you know, Hattie, just to reiterate the point that he talks about our own reflection on whether our students in our classroom are prepared to say in front of the class that they need help or that they don't know what's going on, or they can answer the question, what have you learned? And to foster that atmosphere of trust. And Jo Boaler has her new book, which is really wonderful, Mathematical Mindsets, where she talks a lot about growth mindset and the way we can create the mathematics classroom that moves away from the emphasis on speed and the one correct answer, and really celebrates the power of mistakes, because when we make a mistake and reflect on it, we literally form a new synapse in our brain. So the more mistakes we make, the smarter we get, which I love. I love that. Asking students to provide feedback as well. So who's assessing? Right, we've got our students who often will ask us, is this right, or how do I do this? Right, the two questions I've certainly heard many times. So how do we work in the zone of proximal development, where we're deciding how much help does a student need to succeed in the task? And I think our impulse as teachers, and it's a good one, or it comes from good intentions, but it actually is when we need to, I think, step back from and reflect on, and that is that we want to help our students. We kind of want to go in there and support them and give them the answer, and I think sometimes we give them too much right away because we want to unstick them. But again, I'm thinking of John Vanderwall's quote, the one who's doing the thinking is the one who's doing the learning. So some possible responses. Does your answer make sense? So when they say, is this right? Well, does your answer make sense? How might you best check the accuracy of your answer? So putting it back to them, giving the cognitive work back to them. But again, it's important it's that nuance of doing it within the zone of proximal development. So they're not continuing to stay frustrated and challenged and feel in that, that really, really uncomfortable, unproductive zone. But yes, like you're saying, the productive struggle, Maria. And how do I do this? Some responses might be, well, what might be the best place for you to begin? What is it that you don't know that you need to know? How might you find out, right? So some simple prompts so that they're building the self-regulation, so that they're starting to assess their own knowledge, their own abilities, their own background knowledge, their own habits of mind. And again, any ideas that you have, please feel free to put them in the chat box. And I talked about this in the last webinar, but Alan Schoenfeld, who's a great mathematics education professor, talks about the 3 prompts for metacognition. And he says you can, you can ask these 3 questions of a student, and you want them to internalize these questions. So when they're solving a problem, what are you doing? Why are you doing it? And how is it helping you? And that builds that metacognition so that they're assessing their ability to solve a problem as they're doing it. Because we are not the only ones assessing. We want to build the student's capacity to assess themselves. Or writing out learning goals, and rather than giving grades, using a PIN, proficient in process or not yet. And I do this quite a bit in my math class, and it was radical. I told my students, like, they don't get a grade that often in my class, but they get a lot of feedback, whether oral or written, or sometimes in the form of this, PIN. And their ability to say, where are you? Are you able to find the square root of a number? Can you clearly represent the square root? So they are also involved in the assessment dimension. Gallery walks can be a form of peer assessment. I've got this great example, and there's a link here for you to check it out. And Michelle has just kindly put it in the chat box, where you see the students providing this beautiful feedback to their peers on what they're doing in class. And great questions that they ask as well. And so that everybody's involved in assessment. It's not just on the shoulders of the teacher, right? Everyone's involved. Yes, this is a Padlet, Jennifer. And they are great. When you can get the computers working, they're great. Or get enough of them for everybody, they're great. And just sort of the final piece of, why are we assessing? We're assessing to nurture growth. And we're assessing to be a source of motivation and engagement as opposed to, deflation. And we're assessing to measure what really matters. We're assessing to really measure the depth of thinking and the quality of thinking in our students. So that's why we're assessing. We're not assessing to sort, our students. We're assessing to, not to sort, but to support. And just to sort of bring it all back, I'd like you to take a moment right now, just another 2 minutes, to return to this question that we've been looking at and to please add or revise or extend some of your thinking. So just another minute to gather and integrate some of your thinking. And just to finish up, I wanted to show you one very rich task where, again, we're talking about something or a task that can really surface the kind of thinking that we're talking about. I just wanted to show you an example, and this one is from Joe Bowler. We're talking about, again, just returning to the principles of the thinking classroom and continuous inquiry. I just want to end our time just going into this for just a moment and looking at this particular rich task, which can be scaffolded across from the junior to the intermediate grades, where you can see the depth of thinking that this requires and the kind of intellectual engagement that is being created, I think, for students. And you can get that link. Michelle has put it in the chat box so that you can take a look at it if you didn't have a chance to really look at it here. And this is from a book that I've got listed in one of the resources of great open-ended questions from grades 5 to 8. So here's some really good open-ended questions that are specifically relating to number sense, but where again you're thinking about the kind of student thinking that you can surface and then be able to assess and evaluate. Thinking about the kind of information you get from students grappling with some of these open-ended questions. Thank you. And then Preet talks about some good questions from Peter Sullivan for K-6. Thank you for sharing that. So when we think about observing our students with these rich tasks and how we have an opportunity to assess the thinking as it's made more visible. And when we look back on that original, we had the Abbott and Costello, but when we had just the answers that were written there, we really didn't have a lot of information. And so part of assessment is how we can really surface the kind of thinking as we become more skilled at identifying the intellectual tools that we want to see reflected through the mathematical processes. And that transcends or is integrated across all of the concepts that we're studying. So rather than organizing or thinking only in terms of these discrete units, when we start organizing according to the quality of thinking, those processes we want to see across all of the different mathematical topics. And it really is working on the complex mathematics that enables the brain connections to develop. What we practice becomes what we're good at. So the more we're engaged in critical thinking tasks, the more we're going to grow in our capacity to be a great critical thinker. I did just want to turn your attention to some of the helpful resources, including the book that's come out by Roland Case and Garfield Ginny Newman, Creating Thinking Classrooms. That is key text around some of the work the Consortium has done over the last number of decades that really outlines these principles. So if you're intrigued by the 5 principles of a thinking classroom, that book really goes into greater depth about that. I want to thank all of you for spending time during a Thursday evening to be here and learn. It's great to be with all of you and to have learned with you. And I'd love to hear your comments or questions. So again, please feel free to connect with me through Twitter or email, and also to check out the website and some of the tools for thought. I hope you all have a great evening, and I hope tomorrow you have a wonderful day in your classrooms.
Time flies when we're having fun. We're actually ahead of the allotted time, despite all the subjects we covered tonight. So thank you so much for sharing your enthusiasm and expertise with us, Maria. It was truly an impressive presentation with tons of extremely useful ideas and tips. Somehow with my limited mathematical skills, I always suspected that 7 times 13 equals 28, but now I finally understand why. I also want to thank all of you for being such incredibly motivated participants and dedicated teachers, willing to take from your family time and improve your skills and share your knowledge with us. It's always wonderful to see how cooperative these OTF sessions truly are, and how you all jump in to share your experience, your ideas, and even your jokes. So you are really a great group tonight. And of course, Jennifer gets the OTF Honorary Humor Award. So thanks for making us laugh, Jennifer. So at this point, if you have been on a number of OTF Connect sessions recently, or if you are eager to return to your families for the remainder of the evening, I simply want to wish you all a very, very good night and remind you to complete our feedback survey. You should be redirected automatically to the survey when exiting Blackboard, but just in case, I'm going to also paste it in the chat box. Here it is. For those of you who are still fairly new to OTF Connect, or can spare another few minutes, I would like to give you a few additional pieces of information before we conclude this session. We have a number of exciting sessions related to mathematics in the coming days. On May 2nd, we have Visit My Grade 6 Math class, which should be very interactive and a lot of fun. On May 11, we have Math for English Language Learners. And for those of you who have followed the first 2 sessions presented by Laura Ginny Newman, we have part 3 of creating a thinking math classroom that you won't want to miss on May 18. Her area of interest is in fact very similar to what Maria shared with us tonight. Next, what about the French? What about the franco-ontarien? So, bonne nouvelle aussi pour nos collègues franco-ontariens. Nous avons également quelques sessions en français planifiées pour les prochains mois. La session de Suzanne Forrester le 30 mai, intitulée « Le français en tant que deuxième langue », sera principalement en français, mais les interventions et questions en anglais seront toujours bienvenues. Et nous avons également une session le 1er juin intitulée « La Révolution française » ou l'utilisation de la technologie au cœur de la classe de français. Cette session présentée par Myriam Mallette sera également bilingue avec prédominance du français. So both sessions will be kind of bilingual, although predominantly in French, and I certainly invite you to participate if you can, and to improve your French, why not? Remember also to visit our resource page with past presentations and our calendar page to learn about future sessions, and please always encourage all your colleagues to register. And I'm going to quickly paste these 2 links as well in the chat box. And here they are. For those of you who are new to OTF Connect, I want to tell you about another opportunity provided by OTF and by the Ministry of Education. If you are a qualified teacher and completed an additional qualification course in math, technology, or kindergarten, you may be eligible for a $450 subsidy. And here is the link to apply for that subsidy. I'm going to put it in the chat as well. As indicated earlier, we also would like to present you with the opportunity to give us your feedback on tonight's session and fill a short online questionnaire. The survey only takes a few minutes. If you could do it right after the session, it would be greatly appreciated. You should be redirected automatically to the survey page when quitting Blackboard. And again, I'm going to paste the survey link as well in the chat box, just in case, but you should be redirected when quitting the application. This survey is very important to us. We listen carefully to your feedback and pass it on to our facilitators, and they appreciate a lot receiving the feedback. and it also helps us with funding of future OTF Connects program. As a new feature of our webinar, OTF would like to offer you a small bonus as a token of appreciation for your participation. Once you have completed the feedback questionnaire, you will be redirected to another page, allowing you to enter your name. You will then receive a certificate of participation to this training session that you will be able to add to your professional learning resume. Please note that the certificate of participation is only available for 48 hours following the session. If you don't have the time to complete the survey right now, or if you missed anything tonight, so don't worry, we will send you in the next 24 hours a follow-up email with a link to this recorded session, to the feedback survey, and archived presentation. And I'm also going to provide you quickly with the link to Maria's session, tonight's session. Here is the link. I will now end the recording session. Please feel free to remain online if you want to ask Maria additional questions once the recording has ended. Otherwise, I wish you all a very good evening, and thank you again for participating in tonight's session. We hope to see you very soon on OTF Connects. Thanks to all.
Thank you so much, Michelle, for your moderating tonight.
Thanks, Maria.